Millions of years ago, long before cities, roads, or modern weapons existed, the African wilderness was a completely different world. The land was vast, wild, and unforgiving. Across endless grasslands, giant prehistoric animals moved through the landscape. Some were enormous herbivores, powerful enough to crush a human beneath their feet. Others were deadly predators, armed with sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and incredible speed. And somewhere within this dangerous world lived a small group of early humans. They were not the strongest creatures on the land. They were not the fastest. They had no metal weapons, no shelters made of concrete, and no way to call for help. They had only simple wooden spears, sharp stones, fire, teamwork, and each other. Among them was a young couple who had learned that survival was not only about strength. It was about protecting the person you loved. As the sun slowly rose over the ancient African savanna, the couple walked side by side through tall golden grass. The woman stayed close to her partner, carefully watching the surrounding landscape. Every sound mattered. A sudden movement in the grass could mean danger. A distant roar could signal the presence of a predator. Even the silence could be frightening. The man held a sharpened wooden spear in his hands. He looked toward the horizon, then back at the woman beside him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. There was no language like ours, no written promise, but their expressions said enough. They depended on one another. Suddenly, the birds in the nearby trees became silent. The woman stopped walking. She had heard something. A deep, rustling sound moved through the grass. The man immediately raised his spear. Both of them stood completely still. Then, several meters away, the tall grass began to move. Something enormous was approaching. A huge prehistoric predator slowly emerged from the vegetation. Its powerful body moved with terrifying. The next morning, the early human group began moving toward a distant river. They needed water, they needed food, and they needed a safer place to spend the coming night. The sun was already high when they reached the edge of the ancient river. From a distance, the water looked calm, almost peaceful, but the people knew better. In this world, calm water could hide terrible danger. The group stopped at the riverbank. Several adults searched the surrounding vegetation while others watched the water. The young couple stayed together. The man carefully examined the muddy ground. He noticed strange tracks near the edge. They were far larger than human footprints. Something enormous had recently passed through the area. The woman looked toward the dark water. She suddenly noticed two eyes just above the surface. She froze. The man followed her gaze. A giant prehistoric crocodile was silently watching them. Its enormous body was almost completely hidden beneath the water. Only its eyes and nostrils were visible. The group immediately stepped backward, but the river was the only source of water for miles. They could not simply abandon it. The elders of the group began searching for a safer crossing point. Eventually, they found a narrow section where the water was shallower. The humans decided to cross quickly. The man entered first. He carried a wooden spear in one hand while reaching toward his beloved with the other. She followed carefully. The water reached their knees, then their waist. Every step was dangerous. Suddenly, the water exploded behind them. The giant crocodile attacked. The group screamed and scattered toward the riverbank. The man turned around. The predator was moving directly toward the woman. He rushed back. He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. She slipped in the mud. For a second, she disappeared beneath the water. The man immediately reached down and pulled her up. The crocodile came closer. Morning arrived slowly over the ancient African wilderness. A thin layer of mist covered the grass. The first rays of sunlight passed through the trees, revealing the exhausted faces of the early humans. They had survived another night, but their food supplies were almost gone. The group needed a hunt, and hunting in this ancient world was not simply about finding an animal. It was about entering the territory of creatures far larger and more dangerous than themselves. The leader gathered the strongest members of the group. They carried wooden spears and sharpened stones. The young couple joined them. The man checked the sharp point of his spear. The woman watched the surrounding grass carefully. Together, They moved away from the camp. Their footsteps were slow and quiet. They followed fresh tracks through the mud. The tracks belonged to a large, prehistoric herbivore. It was powerful. It was fast, and if frightened, it could easily kill a human. The hunters followed the tracks for several hours. Then they reached a wide valley. The ground suddenly began to shake. The woman stopped. She looked toward the horizon. A herd of enormous prehistoric animals was moving across the valley. Their massive bodies towered above the grass. Dust rose beneath their feet. The humans watched from behind a group of rocks. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. They were witnessing one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The leader finally pointed toward a smaller animal at the edge of the herd. It was separated from the others. That was their opportunity. But getting close would be extremely dangerous. The hunters slowly spread out. The young man moved toward the left. His beloved followed carefully behind him. They communicated through simple gestures. No words were necessary. They had learned to work as one. The hunters moved closer. The animal suddenly lifted its head. It had noticed them. The group froze. For several seconds, not. The sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. Darkness slowly covered the ancient African wilderness. The early humans gathered around their small campfire. After the failed hunt, everyone was exhausted. There was not enough food. The children stayed close to their mothers. The adults watched the darkness beyond the fire. The young couple sat together near the edge of the group. The woman leaned against her partner. He gently held her hand. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But deep inside the darkness, something was moving. A low growl suddenly echoed through the trees. Everyone became silent. The fire crackled. Then another sound came. A heavy footstep. Then another. Something enormous was approaching the camp. The man slowly stood up. He picked up a spear. The woman stood beside him. The other hunters grabbed their weapons. Nobody knew exactly what was coming. Then two glowing eyes appeared beyond the firelight. A massive prehistoric predator stepped out of the darkness. Its powerful body was covered in dust and scars. Its jaws opened. A terrifying roar shook the entire camp. The children screamed. The adults formed a protective circle around them. The predator moved closer. The humans shouted and raised their spears. But the giant animal did not retreat. It wanted food, and the humans were trapped between the darkness and the fire. The leader ordered everyone to stay together. The young man stood directly in front of the woman. She grabbed his arm. The predator suddenly charged. The humans screamed and thrust their spears forward. The animal stopped only a few steps away. One spear struck the ground. Another hit its shoulder. The predator roared and moved backward. For the first time, the humans realized something. The fire had given them power. The beast feared the flames. The group quickly pushed burning branches toward the edge of the camp. The fire grew brighter. Smoke filled the air. The morning after the terrifying night, the ancient wilderness looked peaceful again. Golden sunlight spread across the grasslands. Mist slowly disappeared from the valley. But the early humans knew that danger had not disappeared. They had almost no food left. The children were hungry. The adults were exhausted. They had to move. The group packed what little they had and began walking toward a distant valley. The young couple stayed close together. The man carried his wooden spear. The woman carried a small bundle of food and tools. They moved carefully through the tall grass. Every few steps, they stopped and listened. Then they heard a deep rumbling sound. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Everyone froze. The sound grew louder. Suddenly, enormous shadows appeared through the morning mist. A herd of gigantic prehistoric animals was moving toward them. Their massive bodies towered over the grass. Their footsteps shook the ground. The humans immediately moved away from their path. Nobody wanted to stand between such powerful animals. The herd passed slowly. The young woman watched in amazement. She had never seen so many giant creatures together. The man gently pulled her backward as one enormous animal came dangerously close. They waited until the herd disappeared into the distance. Then they continued their journey. By midday, the group reached the valley. It looked perfect. There was water. There were trees. There were fruits and roots. For the first time in many days, the people felt hope. But the leader noticed something disturbing. There were enormous footprints near the water. Fresh footprints. The group became silent. Whatever had made them was still nearby. The hunters carefully followed the tracks. They discovered a large carcass hidden beneath the trees. Something enormous had killed it. The humans immediately understood. This valley belonged to a predator. The leader ordered everyone to move out. The next morning began beneath a thick blanket of mist. The ancient valley was almost invisible. Trees appeared like dark shadows. The grass was wet with morning dew. And somewhere beyond the fog, something enormous was moving. The early humans woke quietly. The fire from the previous night had almost disappeared. The leader immediately noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks around the camp. Huge tracks, much larger than the footprints they had seen before. The group became silent. Something had come close during the night. Something enormous. The young man slowly stood up and picked up his spear. The woman moved beside him. She looked into the fog. Nothing could be seen. Then came a deep breathing sound. Slow, heavy, close. Everyone froze. A huge shadow appeared through the mist. At first, it looked like a mountain. Then it moved. The giant prehistoric beast stepped into view. Its enormous body was covered in thick skin. Its head was massive. Its eyes were fixed on the humans. The group began moving backward. The animal did not attack. It simply watched. The humans realized something important. This was not a predator. It was a giant herbivore. But that did not make it harmless. A frightened giant herbivore could be just as deadly. The animal suddenly raised its head. A branch cracked beneath its foot. The young woman stepped backward. The man reached for her hand. Then one of the children cried out. The giant animal became startled. It suddenly charged. Panic spread through the group. Everyone ran. The young couple raced toward a rocky hill. The woman stumbled. The man turned around. He grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Behind them, the enormous animal thundered across the valley. The ground shook beneath their feet. The humans reached the rocks. They climbed quickly. The animal rushed past them. It did not stop. It continued toward the trees until it disappeared into the mist. The group R. The next morning, the early humans left the valley. The sun was barely visible above the distant mountains. A cold wind moved through the grass. The group carried their few remaining possessions and began walking toward unfamiliar territory. They had no map, no road, no knowledge of what waited ahead. They only knew that staying in one place for too long was dangerous. The young couple walked near the center of the group. The man carried a spear over his shoulder. The woman held a small bundle of food close to her chest. They were tired, but they continued. After several hours, the landscape began to change. The grass became shorter. The trees became larger. Dark rocky cliffs rose on both sides of the valley. The group entered a narrow passage. Everyone became quiet. The walls were so high that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The leader stopped. He noticed strange scratches along the rocks. Large claw marks. Fresh ones. The humans looked at each other. Something had been here recently. The young woman moved closer to her partner. He gently reached for her hand. Then they heard it. A low growl. It came from somewhere above them. Everyone looked upward. Nothing. Another growl. This time from behind. The group turned. A giant prehistoric predator stepped into the passage. It blocked their escape. The animal stared at them. Its powerful body filled the narrow opening. The humans slowly moved backward. Then another roar echoed from the other side. The group froze. There was another predator. They were surrounded. Panic spread through the group. The children began crying. The adults raised their spears. But the leader knew that fighting two giant predators in such a narrow place would be almost impossible. He searched the cliffs. Then he noticed a small opening between the rocks. It was barely large enough for a human to enter. He pointed toward it. Everyone understood. They had to move quickly. The humans be. The terrifying roar continued through the night. It echoed across the ancient plain. The early humans remained awake beside their fire. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to make a sound. Even the distant animals had become strangely quiet. Something was coming. Something enormous. The young couple sat close together. The woman held her partner's hand tightly. He watched the darkness beyond the fire. Every few moments, the ground seemed to tremble. Then came another sound. A deep, heavy footstep. Boom! The humans looked at each other. Another step. Boom! The ground shook beneath them. The leader slowly raised his hand. Everyone remained still. Through the darkness, a gigantic silhouette appeared on the horizon. At first, it looked like a moving mountain. Then the moonlight revealed its enormous body. It was one of the largest creatures the humans had ever seen. The giant animal moved slowly across the plain. Its footsteps were powerful enough to shake the ground. The humans watched in complete silence. The young woman looked frightened. Her partner gently placed his hand on her shoulder. The creature was not hunting them. It was simply passing through. But then something unexpected happened. A group of smaller predators began following the giant animal. They were waiting for an opportunity. The humans watched carefully. The giant creature suddenly became alert. It turned toward the predators. The predators stopped. For several seconds, the animals faced one another. Then the giant charged. The smaller predators scattered. The enormous creature chased them away. The humans watched in amazement. For the first time, they realized that size could protect a creature, but it could also make it a target. The giant animal eventually disappeared into the darkness. The group finally relaxed. The young couple looked at each other. They had witnessed something incredible. The ancient world was not simply a battle between humans and Oni. The predators charged across the open ground. The early humans stood together. There was nowhere to run. Behind them was the water. In front of them were the predators. The young couple stood side by side. The man held his wooden spear tightly. The woman picked up a sharp stone. Neither wanted to leave the other behind. The first predator came closer. The leader shouted. Every hunter raised their spear at the same time. The predator suddenly stopped. It had expected frightened prey. Instead, it found a group standing together. The human shouted and moved forward. The predator stepped backward. For a moment, the humans believed they had won. Then another predator attacked from the side. Chaos erupted. The group scattered. The young woman fell near the water. Her partner immediately turned toward her. He ran back. A predator was already moving in her direction. The man placed himself between them. He raised his spear. The predator opened its jaws. The man screamed and thrust the spear forward. The animal jumped backward. The woman quickly stood. She grabbed his arm. Together, they ran toward the rocks. But the predators continued chasing them. The other members of the group began throwing stones. Some struck the ground. Others hit the animals. The predators became confused. The humans were no longer acting like individual prey. They were acting as one. One hunter shouted from the left. Another shouted from the right. The predators could not decide which person to attack. The leader recognized the opportunity. He ordered everyone to make themselves appear larger. The humans raised their spears. They shouted. They waved burning branches that had been carried from the previous camp. The predators stopped. Firelight reflected in their eyes. The animals had encountered this threat before. Slowly, they began backing away. The humans advanced. Step by step, the predators turned. Then they ran. The battle was over. 4. The next morning, the early humans woke before sunrise. The fire had almost completely burned out. A cold wind moved through the rocks. The group was preparing to leave when the leader noticed something unusual. There were fresh tracks outside the shelter. Everyone gathered around them. The tracks were deep, large, and unlike the tracks they had seen before, these showed no signs of hesitation. The predator had walked directly toward their shelter. It had not been afraid of the fire. The young woman looked at her partner. He tightened his grip around his spear. The group moved carefully into the surrounding wilderness. Nobody spoke loudly. Every sound was important. They followed the tracks through the grass. The trail eventually led toward a dense forest. The trees were enormous. Their branches blocked much of the sunlight. The humans entered slowly. The young couple stayed close together. The man watched the ground. The woman watched the trees. Then they heard a strange sound. A branch breaking. Everyone stopped. Another branch broke. but there was no wind. Something was moving nearby. The leader raised his hand. The group froze. Suddenly, a huge prehistoric predator appeared between the trees. It was larger than any predator they had faced before. Its body was powerful. Its movements were quiet, and its eyes remained fixed on the humans. The group slowly backed away. The predator followed. They raised their spears. The predator did not stop. The leader shouted. The humans moved together. The predator charged. Everyone scattered toward the rocks. The young woman ran with her partner. But the predator suddenly changed direction. It was heading straight toward her. The man turned. He grabbed her hand. They ran toward a fallen tree. The predator jumped over it. The couple kept moving. They reached a narrow gap between two enormous rocks. The woman entered first. The man followed. The predator tried to reach them. Night had fallen over the ancient African wilderness. The small human camp was surrounded by darkness. Only the fire provided light. The early humans sat close together, exhausted after another difficult day. For a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful. Then a distant howl echoed across the valley. Everyone became silent. Another howl answered from somewhere behind the rocks. Then another. The young woman slowly looked at her partner. He immediately reached for his spear. The leader stood and looked into the darkness. There was movement beyond the firelight. One pair of eyes appeared. Then another. Then another. The humans realized they were surrounded. A pack of prehistoric predators was moving toward the camp. The children were pulled closer to their mothers. The hunters formed a circle. Spears were raised. Burning branches were placed around the edge of the camp. The predators continued approaching. They were waiting, watching, looking for weakness. The leader understood that attacking them individually would be a mistake. The humans had to stay together. The young couple stood side by side. The woman held a burning branch. The man held his spear. The first predator stepped into the firelight. It growled. The humans shouted. The animal stopped. Another predator appeared behind it. Then another. The pack slowly surrounded the camp. The fire crackled between them. For several moments, neither side moved. Then one predator suddenly charged. The humans thrust their spears forward. The animal stopped and jumped backward. Another predator tried to attack from the opposite side. The group quickly turned together. The hunters shouted and waved the flames. The predators hesitated. The young woman looked at her partner. He nodded. They understood what they needed to do. They moved together toward the weakest side of the pack. Several other hunters followed them. The Predado. The next morning, the early humans woke to a strange silence. The predators from the previous night were gone. But something else had changed. The air felt different. The birds were moving away from the valley. Small animals were disappearing into the trees. Even the giant herbivores that normally cross the plain were moving toward the distant mountains. The leader noticed the signs. Something was forcing the animals to leave. He looked toward the horizon. A dark cloud was rising above the mountains. At first, it looked like an ordinary storm. Then the ground began to tremble. A deep rumbling sound rolled across the valley. The humans stood still. Another tremor shook the earth. The children became frightened. The young couple looked at each other. The man held her hand. Then a distant flash appeared beyond the mountains. A massive plume of smoke rose into the sky. The ancient volcano had awakened. The wilderness suddenly became even more dangerous. Ash began falling from the sky. The sunlight became darker. The group had to make a decision. Stay in the valley or leave everything behind. The leader pointed toward the mountains. The group gathered their belongings. There was no time to wait. They began moving. The young couple stayed near the center of the group. The woman carried food. The man carried a spear. Behind them, the valley slowly disappeared beneath a cloud of smoke. The journey was difficult. Ash covered the ground. The air became difficult to breathe. The humans wrapped animal hides around their faces. They continued walking. After several hours, they reached a narrow river. But the river was rising rapidly. The volcanic activity had changed the water. The current was powerful. The group searched for a safe crossing. The young man found a fallen tree stretching across part of the river. He crossed first. Then he turned toward his beloved. He reached out his hand. She stepped carefully onto the tray.